Today we got to go over books 5 and 6. We're primarily focusing on 6. Book 5 is a lot of recap. Not recap, it's a lot of example. So book 5 is a discussion of justice. That is, what is the scope of justice, what amounts to justice, and understanding justice upon the doctrine of the mean. So we'll do some recap first, and then we'll move on to 6. Okay, so recap. Remember, we've said that there are 2, possibly 3 necessary conditions for eudaimonia. So we have the concept of eudaimonia, which we've been translating as happiness or flourishing. And we said the necessary and jointly sufficient conditions are moral virtue, intellectual virtue, and ostensibly, so I'll bracket it, moral luck. As we'll see starting next week, there is this ostensible 4th condition of friendship. But we'll worry about that next week. What we're focusing right now on is the virtues. We said that our 2 virtues, moral virtue and intellectual virtue, they correlate directly to our distinctive human capacities. So moral virtue correlates directly toward rational self-governance. That is the ability to do things for reasons. In the case of intellectual virtue, response to understanding. Now, don't get this confused, because we will see that understanding is an intellectual virtue. But what rational self-governance and understanding are our human capacities. That is, these are the character traits that make an organism a human being. Okay? And we give some examples. So, for example, remember, all moral virtues must exist along a spectrum of a mean, where the mean, which is relative to the individual as a person practicing wisdom will choose it, is the virtue. We have 2 vices, one of deficiency, and we have a vice of excess. So a very simple example, if we're going to understand this in terms of bravery, bravery would be our mean, brashness would be our vice of excess, and cowardice would be our vice of deficiency. Now, in order for one to be brave, in order for one to instantiate virtue, one must have an understanding of what bravery is about. So that is, one must understand that bravery is about the physical management of fear. In addition to understanding the what that bravery is about, one must understand the features of the situation. That is, one must understand what it is about the situation at hand that demands bravery. So the situation at hand, whether or not there are genuinely things that can induce fear. Moreover, one needs to recognize whether or not the features of the situation, so I'm going to just put some scare quotes, ought to be feared. So it's not enough to simply look at the world around you and pick out all the salient features for moral virtue, but one must also have an understanding of whether or not those features of the world around you properly pick up on moral virtues. So, for example, one may know that that bravery is the management of fear. One may be able to look at a situation and pick out the things that may induce fear. However, one can be mistaken about whether or not the objects in question ought to induce fear. So, for example, if one looks at a situation and sees a room full of cockroaches, okay? So just normal plain Jane cockroaches, and one feels fear, what we may want to say in that situation is that this person, they may understand what bravery is about, because they know that bravery is the management of fear. They may understand the feature situation, so they've identified the cockroaches as that which is inducing fear, but they're mistaken in that they think that cockroaches ought to induce fear. They're mistaken because cockroaches, once again, barring any allergies or things like that, are not the kind of thing that are harmful for human beings. Because cockroaches are not harmful, and as such pose no threat to us, it makes no sense to be afraid of them. Now, you can be disgusted by cockroaches, but disgust is not a virtue. Disgust is just an affective state. It's a feeling. And as Aristotle states, feelings are neither virtuous nor vicious. They're just things that we feel. But it makes no sense to be afraid of cockroaches. And if one is genuinely feeling fear of the room full of cockroaches, then we need to assess where's the error happening. Because it seems like this person is misunderstanding what the threat is. Okay? So this is all fine and dandy for moral virtue. And all moral virtues need to be accessible in terms of the spectrum. Now, that is not to say that Aristotle provides an exhaustive list of moral virtues. He discusses some moral virtues at the latter half of 3, 4, and 5. But the list that Aristotle discusses should not be understood as an exhaustive one. Moreover, Aristotle mentions in Book 1 of the Ethics that insofar as what we are dealing with when we deal with ethics is concerned with human beings, that there has to be a certain degree of flexibility. We're not finding out hard and fast truths the way we were finding out when we do mathematics. Rather, what we were finding out is really good rules of thumb. So Aristotle's is minorly tangential, but still useful. Divides all study in the following way. All things that we study are about things that are either substance, not substance, and are mutable, that is subject to change, and not subject to change. So if something is a substance, yes, versus no. Mutable, yes, versus no. Let me pause real quick. Hey. That sounds good.
So you'll get an email from me.
Okay. Yeah, I definitely want to do that.
Together on it. I just want to give you a heads up so I put this email.
Yeah, thank you. So we have substance. All fields of study for Aristotle fall into one of these 4 quadrants. So things that study substance. So by things that study things that are capable of independent existence, that are subject to change. Here's where ethics is. Because we're studying ethics, we study people, right? But people are subject to change. Things that are substance that are not subject to change. Aristotle thinks that physics belongs here. So when we study physics in the classical sense of physis, not in our contemporary sense of like mechanics and E&M and things like that, but when we study physics in terms of physis, nature, he says, yeah, we're studying things that exist. They're subject to independent existence. But in Aristotle's mind, this is not a contemporary thought. Nature does not change. Nature can never change. Species, Aristotle argues, have always been the same. Species have never changed. And he thinks they never will change. In this field as well, he thinks belongs to metaphysics. That is the study of God. Substance, no. And then this field does not exist. And in here would be things like math. Math does not study real objects. There's no number two, there's no two floating out in the cosmos. These are all abstract ideas, but they're still not subject to change. So this is how Aristotle understands understanding. And the key is that over here, what we are getting when we study things that are substance and subject to change is that we're getting rules of thumb. What I mean by that is the knowledge that we gain in ethics. Yes, we do learn things, but it's less secure than the knowledge we get in mathematics. Why? Because mathematics as a discipline is not subject to change. Ethics, in Aristotle's mind, is subject to change because you're studying people and people change. Okay? So we need to curb our expectations to a degree. Moving on to book 6. So moral virtues are understood in terms of the doctrine of the mean, and moral virtues are developed via habituation, or in the Greek, ethike, which is the relationship to ethics. Intellectual virtues, by contrast, are cultivated via education. And Aristotle identifies 6 intellectual virtues. So whereas with the moral virtues, he does not provide us with an exhaustive list, for the intellectual virtues, he does provide us an exhaustive list. So the first one is, I'm going to put the Greek word here and then I'll put it in the English because sometimes I translate it a little bit differently. We have knowledge. I'll get them all up here and then I'll talk about them, which is translating episteme. Intellect, just translating the word nous. We have practical wisdom. Which is translating the word phronesis. We have art or craft, which is translating the word techne. And then we have we have wisdom, which is translating Sophia. And then we have, I'll translate as understanding. Some of these are a little harder to translate than others. Which is translating dianoia. For today, I want to focus on all of them except phronesis. So practical wisdom. And I'm going to spend next time talking about phronesis, because phronesis for Aristotle is the key intellectual virtue. So let's discuss some of them, the rest of these intellectual virtues, and the role that they're supposed to play in eudaimonia. Because remember, all of these are supposed to come together to produce eudaimonia. Okay. In conjunction with moral virtues, naturally. So let's begin with techne, or craft, art. This is exactly what it sounds like. In Aristotle's mind, in order to be eudaimon, an intellectual virtue is knowing how to do something, knowing how to bring something about in the world. So he has very literally here things like woodworking, masonry, shipbuilding, the ability to produce some kind of artifact from materials. This is an intellectual virtue. Okay. Now you're saying to yourself, why is that an intellectual virtue, right? This is something I do with my hands. The reason Aristotle understands it as an intellectual virtue is because in order to be a shoemaker, a cobbler, for example, one must, it's not the case that a good cobbler, just simply imitates what other cobblers do, right? I can try to imitate what a cobbler does, and I'm going to make a pretty crappy shoe. But in order to be a good cobbler, I must understand some things. I must understand what is the end of my craft, or the purpose of my craft, that is creating footwear suitable for humans. And then I must understand concepts of the foot. So what makes a good shoe? So what are the conditions or the features of a good shoe? And then I must understand how to best bring that about. So what practical steps do I need to take in order to create a good shoe? So being a cobbler or being a woodworker, what have you, a furniture maker, has so much more to do in Aristotle's mind with the intellectual than it does with the physical. The actual doing the thing with your hands, so the actual woodworking, so to speak, in Aristotle's mind is kind of the last part of it. It's the least interesting. But what is most interesting is understanding what is the goal of this craft, and then how to best bring that product about. So if there's craft, let's do nous. Nous, or how did I translate it there? Intellect. So for Aristotle, there are two kinds of propositions. There are demonstrable propositions and indemonstrable propositions. Okay? So a demonstrable proposition is something that is subject to demonstration, something I can prove. I can walk you through a series of steps, provide a deductive argument, and prove to you the validity of the claim. So, for example, this is most easily rendered in mathematics. A squared plus b squared equals c squared, Pythagorean theorem. This is a demonstrable claim, okay? If you do not understand how the Pythagorean theorem works, or more importantly, why it works, a mathematician can show you how the Pythagorean theorem works. By contrast, an indemonstrable proposition would be arithmetic claims, things like 2 plus 2 equals 4. Look at the difference between these two mathematical propositions. I can prove this to you. There is a geometric proof of why the Pythagorean theorem works. So you start with your postulates, you start with your definitions, you start with your axioms, build upon them, and eventually you get here, and we prove the Pythagorean theorem. The same is not the case for arithmetic propositions, like 2 plus 2 equals 4. In order for me to teach you that 2 plus 2 equals 4, all I can do is draw two lines in the sand, 2 draw another 2 lines, have you count the lines, get 2 blocks, get another 2 blocks, have you count the blocks. I can give you examples, but I can't prove it to you. Another example over here of an indemonstrable proposition would be something like the definition of a circle. So the Euclidean definition being a circle is a plane figure bound by a single line, every point on that line equidistant from a center point. I can't prove to you in the same way I can prove to you the Pythagorean theorem the definition of a circle. All I can do is draw circles. I draw circles in different mediums and different sizes, and eventually, and then I tell you the definition, and eventually you're like, yeah, that's what a circle is. Okay? The intellectual virtue of nous is related to indemonstrable propositions. Nous is the ability to grasp indemonstrable propositions. It's that aha moment. It's that moment when I tell you the definition of a circle, and I keep drawing circles, I show you a pizza, show you an apple pie, show you a baseball or something that's a sphere, and you're like, oh, I get it. I get what a circle is. That aha moment that it clicked, that's the intellectual capacity of nous. Interestingly, Aristotle thinks that all of these are human capacities. So remember we said that the intellectual virtues correlate directly to our distinctive human capacity for understanding. These are things that as human beings we have as a first potentiality in virtue of the kind of thing that we are, we have the capacity to do. If I try to sit my cat down for a geometry lesson and tell him the definition of a circle and draw circles in front of him, it's not his fault. I'm pretty stupid. That's a waste of time. Why? Because he does not have the capacity of nous. My cat will never grasp, never have that aha moment of what a circle is, because cats can't do it. By contrast, if I do that with my 2-year-old, that's not a waste of time, because she does have this capacity. And not only does she have the capacity to grasp the definition of a circle, Aristotle thinks that it is vital that she grasp the definition of a circle. It is vital that she exercise her intellectual virtue of nous so that she can eventually be eudaimon, so that she can be happy, she can flourish. In Aristotle's mind, it sounds really, really cruel, but if you are not learned, you will not be happy. Simple as that. You must learn things, and not just things that you like. You must learn things you don't like. You learn your physics, your chemistry, your mathematics, your political science, your economics. You learn all of these things so that in part, you can experience eudaimonia. In Aristotle's mind, this is bizarre to modern students who think that college is just about getting a job. In Aristotle's mind, you can't be happy if you don't know math. You can't be happy because you're not experiencing this nous, this aha moment that is ubiquitous across every domain of study. Aristotle thinks that every domain of study is built upon indemonstrable first principles, what he calls axioms. Okay. The next capacity that we have here, which is directly related to our capacity for nous, so we've done intellect, the techne, is episteme. Episteme or knowledge. So whereas nous was related to indemonstrable first principles, episteme is related to demonstrable principles. It's the ability to grasp things like the Pythagorean theorem. It's the ability to grasp things like the formula for force. It's the ability to grasp things like, Paul's principle. Okay? The ability to grasp all of these multi-step equations is episteme. Okay? It's the ability to go beyond first principles, use the first principles like Legos or building blocks, stack them upon one another, and come to a conclusion. Now there's a distinction here. Knowledge of the Pythagorean theorem is episteme, but this is directly related to the capacity dianoia. Dianoia, if you know any Greek, is a compound word. It means thinking through. Dia is a preposition through. Dianoia, how do I translate this? Understanding. So there's a bit of a disconnect here. I can know that the truth of the Pythagorean theorem. Take me, for example. I know the Pythagorean theorem is true. If you ask me, can I prove the Pythagorean theorem? No. Not at all. Can't prove it to you. I wouldn't even remember where to begin. It's been so long since I've taken geometry. Maybe this is why I'm not happy for Aristotle. I don't know enough math or something. But, so there's two things here. I'm experiencing nous and episteme. I experience nous because I grasp these indemonstrable first principles, these fundamental concepts that are not subject to proof. I grasp the end conclusion, the demonstrable principle, in this case the Pythagorean theorem, but in my case what I am lacking is dianoia. I'm lacking the ability to get from the indemonstrable to the demonstrable, and that's precisely what dianoia is. Dianoia is the ability to get from the indemonstrable first principle and work your way to and understand how to get to the demonstrable principle. So how do I get from the definition of a line, a point, a triangle, and how do I then use all that to get to the Pythagorean theorem? So there's three things here. Understanding the definition of a point, a line, a triangle, that's nous. Understanding the Pythagorean theorem, it's episteme. But then getting there is the third part, and this is dianoia. And Aristotle thinks that even though these three are all related, they're all distinct and they're all necessary for eudaimonia. Okay? Because without them, you're not going to be able to put things together. I'm going to pause there, and next time we're going to talk about Sophia or wisdom very briefly. And then most importantly, we're going to talk about phronesis. We're going to spend most of our time talking about phronesis because phronesis for Aristotle is the chief intellectual virtue. If you do not have phronesis, you are not going to fare well in life, because phronesis is the ability to pick out things in the world. It's the ability to navigate a world that is full of particulars in a way that is prudential and beneficial. All right, let's pause.